Hi, I'm Rob Boss. Welcome to another episode of Screen Printing. So today we want to talk a little bit about inks and ink mixing. We'll be somewhat brief. You'll get more additional information in class. I want to begin by simply saying that in poster printing or art printing, generally speaking, there are two main types of inks: oil-based and water-based inks. Oil-based inks have great permanence. However, they're fairly messy to clean up and create other issues, safety issues particularly. Water-based inks are slightly safer to work with. They are exceptionally available today where they weren't in the past. So they provide a really good opportunity for the screen printer to work at slightly lower cost and with, generally speaking, very good quality. I have a couple of buckets of ink up here that are representative of the types of ink that you'll be using in class. I'd like to sort of draw your attention to this bucket of yellow ink because one of the things that we want to start to talk about right away when we talk about ink mixing for screen printing is the importance of contaminating the ink, or more specifically, not contaminating the ink. So in this particular case, I've got a nice, clean, pure bucket of yellow ink. When I work with that ink, I want to make sure that there's never an instance where I introduce any type of material into that ink that would contaminate it. I want to make sure that dust and other elements don't get in, but even more importantly, I want to make absolutely certain that other colors of ink don't accidentally get interjected into this bucket. So that's a very important aspect of ink mixing. And one of the ways that we ensure that is whenever we remove ink from the bucket, we make sure that we remove it with a clean utensil. In some instances, we use little pieces of chipped mat board like this. Now they may have old ink, but it's dry on there, and we can dip the ink out of the bucket that way and place it where we want to place it. I can also use a rubber spatula to do that, or additionally, I can use a putty knife, or what we sometimes refer to as an ink knife. In any instance, when I use that, I would not want to take that same tool with potentially another color on it and introduce it into the bucket and potentially contaminate the ink and make it less useful than it might be in its pure form. So we want to avoid contamination at all costs. We also want to think a little bit about safety when we're working with inks and mixing inks. And of primary importance with the water-based inks is if we get any on our skin, we want to make sure that we wash it off immediately, probably best with some soap and water. Additionally, we want to think about the fact that these inks have very strong dyes in them, and those dyes will very quickly damage garments that we might wear. So it's a very good idea, as I'm doing today, to wear an apron or a smock to protect the clothing that you are wearing. Additionally important is sometimes if you have really, really good garments, not the thing you want to be mixing your inks in. So make sure to wear older clothes, things that are less valuable. If I then go on to talk about the inks a little bit more, it's very important for us to understand that inks dry very quickly. And that is actually a very positive aspect of them for our purposes. It lets us continue to do additional colors on top of additional colors and do them fairly rapidly. However, that very positive aspect is also weighed against the fact that because the inks dry quickly, we have to be fairly expeditious in what we do. We can't linger when we're working with our inks because they will dry out, and that drying process can cause issues for us. Drying is important to inks, and the speed of drying is very important, and for that reason there are actually chemicals in the ink that are introduced to speed the drying of the inks themselves. So we want to make sure, as I said, that we work expeditiously with our inks. So it's very important then, because the inks can dry quickly, that when we are not working with inks, that the containers that they are in are closed or covered and they're sealed somewhat so that they are not exposed to air. That's a very important aspect of what we do. So those are a few safety things and sort of practical issues to consider. When you're mixing your inks, one of the things you're going to want to be thinking about is the actual process that you use And what I want to do is just very quickly demonstrate one of the ways you can approach the ink mixing process. And let's say that in this instance, I'm going to take a little bit of the yellow ink that I've had out, and I'm going to dip some using one of my chip cards, and I'm going to place a little on the ink mixing slab. And this is the ink mixing slab you'll be using in your course. And the excess I'll wipe off, put back into the bucket, and I can put the card on the lid like that. I'm going to take a little bit of blue for a fairly traditional combination of yellow and blue, and we should see something obviously akin, as you would expect, to a green when we bring these two colors together. Now, it's very important to understand that with screen printing inks, we don't always get the intense, pure relationships that we might anticipate from very pure, intense colors. So there are instances in which we mix additives with our inks in order to try to brighten them some. But both these colors start out quite bright. I'm going to take a little more from the blue bucket. And now I'm not actually mixing my ink, I'm just mixing a color. So I'm using very small quantities to test what a color might look like. So in this case, I'm keeping the cards with the ink that I'm using so that I can reuse them. They haven't been contaminated by anything. And in this case, I can now take an ink knife or one of these mixing cards here, and I can take a small quantity of the blue, and I'm going to slide it over here like this. Take a quantity of that blue, and then I'm going to take a portion of the yellow. I'm going to bring that over here, and I'm going to bring those two colors together to see what kind of green I can achieve. And right now I've got a pretty high level of blue in there, so the green is fairly dark. But if you look, you can also begin to see that the green is not a particularly intense green. It's a fairly muddled green. So in this particular case, it wouldn't be unreasonable for me to think about bringing in an additive ink, maybe a fluorescent ink, and we will have these. This is a red fluorescent ink, and these inks actually have chemical brighteners in them that help to make the ink look a little bit more intense. I should say, let the color look a little bit more intense. But this is how we mix those inks. We have to make sure that the color is uniform and that we've mixed all of the color together. You notice when I'm just testing this color that I try to keep my ink in one small area, and that minimizes the ability of the ink to dry out too quickly. But now I can take that ink and kind of spread it a little bit and see that's a combination of approximately a 50-50 mixture of blue and yellow. It is not a very bright green. It is a somewhat mossy, olivey kind of color. So it might be necessary in a case like this that we add an additional ink to brighten that color a little bit. So that is the ink mixing process. If I'm mixing a color, I'm going to set my little spatula down here, my ink mixing knife down here. If I'm mixing a larger quantity of color, then I might mix my quantity in a bowl. And I've got a couple sample bowls up here to show you. And one of the questions that frequently comes up for screen printers is, how much ink do I need? For a fairly small edition, which is what you'll be doing most of the semester, from about 5 prints to 10 prints, you are only going to need about 1/3 of a cup to 1/2 of a cup of ink to complete that particular color. Now, 1/3 of a cup if you have fairly small amounts of color being printed on your paper, 1/2 cup maybe if you have a little bit larger. The cups have indications on the bottom as to what their size is, and you can use this to determine whether in fact you've been able to create the correct quantity of ink. If there's not enough, you're going to need to create a little bit more. So when we're mixing these inks in, after we've got them set, what we want to do is make sure that we clean everything with great care and that we don't contaminate any other inks. So I would remove these covers, place them back on the ink containers. If I have excess ink, I would want to take the excess ink and place it in one of these small deli tubs that we keep in the screen printing studio. We have many of these around the studio that contain extra inks that can still be used very practically in future prints. I want to make sure that I remove all the ink from the surface of the table so that the table is appropriate for mixing another color either by yourself or another student. So When mixing inks, keep in mind that they dry very quickly. You want to make certain that you mix a proper quantity, and when you're done, please be certain that you clean sufficiently to allow the surface to be available and practical for the next user. So I look forward to seeing you in our next episode.